know this room, which is very large.
Actually, I haven't been in here.
No? Just few minutes. Good evening. Just a very short introduction to the first lecture, which is introducing our workshop by Sandy Attia from the Studio Modus Architect. Sandy has a very interesting background. She is from Egypt originally, but she was educated in the United States at Harvard University. Then, starting from 2000, with Matteo Scaggion, they founded a studio in Brixen, in Italian is Bressanone, which is a very, very successful, interesting studio where they design at different scales, from large-scale infrastructure, but also until the object. And they, in this practice, they won really a lot of awards. The last one was the prize for Italian architecture in Triennale di Milano. That was they are the architects of 2022. She's also teaching. Now we have the honor of having Sandy teaching in our program here in Piacenza since 1 year. But previously she was working in important international universities like, for example, Princeton. But I think she has to show us very interesting and a lot of slides. So I give the floor to Sandy for her lecture. Thank you again for accepting to be here with us tonight.
Okay, so everyone can hear. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure, I can put this here. Is it stable? I'm not a singer. Can you tell me? Okay, we'll see if it. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I'm really sorry about being late. So a lot of expectation in the air. I hope you guys have had a good day, first day of the workshop. And I was thinking about which projects to show you, and I decided to start, well, let's say half the presentation. I'll be presenting projects that have to do with infrastructure. And then I'll show you guys a project that we just won recently, a competition that's also kind of at the infrastructural scale. And then if there's time, we'll finish just for fun within a hotel. So the title of the lecture is Between Ground and Sky. And where do I have to point here? Oh, okay. Okay. So, like Professor Pertuzzoni said, we work at different scales, which is true, but I think it's important to mention that we work in South Tyrol, which, like was mentioned, I'm not from there, so, but I've been there for over 20 years, so I can't keep saying that, but I do not speak German, which is not very convenient in a work environment that is often in German. But the thing that I think is important to know is that most of our work, like 95% of our work is in South Tyrol, and it's in actually a very dense condition. So it's valleys and mountains, so it's in the north, it's in the Dolomites region. It's known in Italy as being the kind of privileged area because they have a kind of hunger, desire to there's a really rich dialogue between clients and architects for contemporary architecture. So for many, it's considered a kind of bubble environment where, the streets are golden and so on and so forth. But what's important to know is that even when you work in the infrastructural scale, it's actually a really small scale. And I think that's kind of interesting, is that perhaps this is how I've been thinking about it for you guys, that perhaps for the workshop, you are, yes, working at a scale that's at an urban scale, it's at a scale that intersects city and landscape and architecture, but it's in these small acts that transformation takes place, and it's in the generation of these small acts that I can imagine that the work you're going to embark on is able to be transformative on the grander scale. So with that in mind, I thought I would speak about these infrastructural projects that don't resonate in terms of geography with what you guys are about to do, but it's helpful perhaps to think about some of the very basic issues that bind a lot of us together in the work we do, and that has to do with the ground plane, and very simply put, in this kind of space between ground and sky. And it's at that place that it's actually where my husband and partner, Matteo Scagnolo, and I, we met at when we were doing our masters. We met in a course that was called Cinco Semper Mis, it was being held by Barry Bergdahl, who is an incredible professor. He's one of the professors that kind of is emblazoned in your mind. And he's also, I think, curator at MoMA now, or has been for many years, and he's teaching at Columbia. Anyway, in this course, I discovered Cinco. So Cinco is not a modern architect, but this image is something that has always stayed with me. And Matteo and I, we wrote a paper together on his work and the relationship between the ground and sky and how it's rooted in the ground. And that actually what happens above ground and what happens below ground can have very different qualities. But what binds them together are these roots that grow from above and below, and the connection from the ground up into the sky that I always felt was really interesting. And so if you see in this middle, you have this really celestial temple-like pavilion that has, that's graphically represented with these roots that go into this ground, which is this carved out space that is a neoclassical space or classical space that has this kind of ziggurat carved out spaces that, yeah, it might be better.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's better if is that better? Okay. And so this image has been something that I go back, well, I don't really go back to it, but every time I happen to cross it, there's something very, that's something that resonates with the way we think about our work and the way the ground plane is actually something really charged. And when you're working in a topographical condition, which is the condition we're working with, underground spaces are inevitable. And so how do you bring light into them? How do you connect them between above and below ground? Do you make them similar? Is there kind of a communication between the two? I mean, it opens up a whole host of questions just by thinking in that line, that space, what could happen there. So it's in that thickness that I want to talk about these first set of projects that have to do with infrastructure. And these, like I said, these are actually really old projects, and this project has never been built. We keep thinking that it's going to be built. But there's these, I think there's 4 projects that I'm going to show, and they're all in their own way in our area. I mean, so everything very circumscribed, but in our area, they're considered to be pilot projects because they're projects that are outside the canons, let's say, of a traditional architectural project. It might be more relegated to the engineer, or they're projects that just are not really entered into the mainstream culture of architecture. So that's what is interesting, because that's where you can be a little creative. And in this first project, it's along the A22, so that's the north-south corridor that connects the north to the south. They always talk about this north to south corridor between Middle Europe and Italy to the south. And it's a highway that runs through South Tyrol, and of course it's really heavily trafficked and so on and so forth. Well, they put, in this rest stop that they put there, they have this huge, really, well, it's a really ugly building that houses some of Plessy, he's an artist, he houses some of his work. However, the parking for this rest area is on the other side. And so the question was simply, how do you connect? How do you bring motorists who come from one side to the other? And you can't build a bridge, so you have to go underground. And so we worked with these two towers that create this, these markers along the highway. And in this act of going down and below the ground, we created this kind of oral landscape that you're not going to hear because I didn't want to go into it. But we worked with a sound artist who studied all of the dialect and how it changes along the A22 and kind of registers that north-south corridor. And so in this connection between this really loud, noisy mobility world, how do you make that connection between fast-moving cars and then to go see a piece of art while you're on your rest stop along the highway? So these are some images. So that the brown roof building is the building that houses the artwork, which is existing. And then you have your parking to the left. And then we have these two towers that kind of act as, like, as flippers along that mark this place that you can go and connect from one side to the other. And so here you have a few images where you see that in site plan. And so, sorry, kind of an awkward angle. So this is the Plessy Museum. These are the two flippers, and then this is all the parking that goes along if you're going towards the south. So you have to go underneath. You can see it is really poorly traced, and then you come out. And so this is a very loud environment. So the idea is that you come down and you kind of live this artistic space that talks about all these cultures that you're just whizzing by. These cultures, these different dialects, so the little mini changes from one place to another as you are a motorist along the north-south corridor. So in plan, we were working with this idea of making this space. So you come down and there are these oral spaces. Oral is in oral spaces where they're dedicated to certain aspects of A22, which has really a fascinating history and how it changed the landscape and the way people moved through move from north to south and south to north and so on and so forth. And these are all in plan, the shape of the pillars that you can see, the kind of a typological manifestation of the pillars of the highway. So this is an example of how just going below ground from one side of the highway to the other can become an architectural space. And with this, we came into contact with a number of administrations that had the difficulty of navigating the infrastructure that goes into the energy supply of these townships. So we're not talking big cities. This is the town of Bressanone, where I live. And there's a logic that happens underground that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with any urban qualities or the kind of growth of the city and so on and so forth. And so with these two projects, this one in particular is one of our very early projects where we were asked to revise the engineer's project for a cogeneration plant. And this just happened to replace a kind of asphalted area that was used by the skaters, so the skateboarders of Bressanone. And it was also right next to an important convent, so kind of medieval texture to the city. And they had to put this, energy infrastructural object in a place that was along the river by a bridge, by a medieval structure, and that was replacing, part of the social life of the youth of Bressanone. So they asked us to, give a kind of facelift to this project, which is the beginning of a series of projects that we were asked to work with the engineers in a way that transformed a purely functional building into something that had a kind of architectural quality to it. And the same goes for, and so what you see here is the town of Bressanone, and this is the infrastructure of the connections of the various cogeneration plants and also the subsidiary heating plant that all work to feed in to give energy to Bressanone for the hot water. So with this being said, we said, okay, well, what kind of architecture would you place in these places? And we decided to work with a metallic structure and to kind of embrace the ethos of these more engineering, of these projects that are dedicated more to the sphere of engineering. And so here you see this building that has some skate ramps placed on top of it. And basically what we said, okay, here you have your basic functional building where all the machinery is housed. This is the Izarca River. There's people walk and jog along here all the time. Is one of the main bridges that connects the two sides of the town. This, like I said, is a convent, and this is a school, and so on and so forth. The kind of residential qualities that I live like over here, and so we said, okay, well, let's use this roof plane as and reclaim the ground and kind of give a thickness, like I said, to the ground, and just use the this metal mesh as a safety net, literal safety net for the skateboarders. So this is what we proposed. We actually proposed 3 or 4 different projects to the municipal services, and we said, instead of saying it's either or, now it's a skate park no longer, and then it's going to be cogeneration plant. Why can't you have both? And this idea of putting programs together, making a hybrid building, was something very strange. I mean, now it doesn't seem anything, groundbreaking, but at the time it was considered very strange, and is this possible, and what kind of, legislation do we need that can, govern the safety of the kids going up on the roof? And so it became, an interesting discussion, but it became this building was actually really embraced by the people in Bressanone because it had an architectural quality to it, quite simply put. And so here you see that. So like I said, this is the main bridge, and this is where, so it sits really along the river. This is where the heating plant is. And we just gave this over to the city, and we said, this is your platform. There was no budget. I mean, we couldn't just say, oh, municipal services, can you give us a budget also for a skate park? And we said, this, you can use it how you want, but we propose that you use it as a skate park because there's already the equipment, there are the kids, they want to skateboard. And that's what happened. And it was really interesting because it was self-governed. The skateboard kids came to our office and said, these are the equipment that we have, and they just came and placed it on there. And there's this ramp that connects, so along, it's a very small gesture, but thinking about, okay, well, how do people get here? They get here along this route or along the river, and so there's this ramp that brings you up onto this platform where it became the skate park. And so, you also have a nice view, and this kind of lines of the metal mesh create this dialogue with the surrounding landscape. So as you can see, Bressanone, it's the other thing about Bressanone and in most towns in South Tyrol is that valley and mountain they're collapsed. They have a really close relationship. And so when you're in the valley, you see the mountain. I mean, they go straight up. And that whatever you work on has to also think about what, the roof is a fifth facade. I mean, you hear that a lot, but it's really true for where we're working. So here in section, it's just carved into the ground. This is all the machinery. There's a big window so that people, as they're this is the bike path. This is where people jog and they go walking, and this is the river. So they can look into and kind of see this world of machinery that usually is completely hidden, let's say, or it's a world that's not interesting or somehow separate from city life. And so it was an introduction into, okay, well, how can we incorporate these buildings that produce energy for the city into the kind of life of the city itself? And we worked with some lighting engineers that hooked up the system to how much energy was being produced with the way the building was lit up. So there was a kind of code that was scripted so that the amount of energy that was being produced had an effect on the kind of light quality to the building itself. So here you see two images of the ramp, and this ramp is it's instead of the residue heat that is cast off, instead of putting them all in chimneys, we put them underneath this ramp, which is just a graded ramp. And so in the wintertime, it's actually a place where all the kids kind of hang out. It's nice and warm. And it also has this kind of, you know, night disco effect that skateboarders really like. So here is, these, like I said, these are really old images. They're not particularly nice, but I thought one thing to start thinking about, you know, what is your relationship between your urban fabric and the buildings that have to do with energy that feed that township. The other one that then came off of this project was the subsidiary heating plant. So what happened with the cogeneration plant is that during the night, the heat that is produced, it's not used as much, of course, during the night. And so they said, okay, let's get these big cisterns of water that can then store and collect the heat in a more efficient way that then can be fed back into the cogeneration plant and then fed into the city. And so the thing about these reservoirs is that they're actually really big, and they had a site, the city had a site that was right next to a school, and so there was this big discussion about, you know, what should we do? They're so high, they become like these towers. And, you know, and we said, okay, let's, you know, again, we'll bury them half into the ground, and we'll consider this piece of infrastructure as a kind of urban furniture that has a kind of civic decor to it. So, I mean, on the one hand, it seems a little, oh, it's just like an aesthetic gesture, but on the other hand, it's a way in which you begin to think of these industrial buildings as part of the city fabric that can too be part of the architectural discussion. So here I'm showing an old image of when they started to bring in the systems. They did it at night because they're worried about what people were going to say. I mean, it was all kind of covert. They didn't want people to realize, you know, what huge, I mean, huge for Barcelona, what these large cisterns were going to be like. And we kind of played with this, you know, over alto form to it. But that it's a world that you can actually, you know, people ask for tours of this little building to go down and experience this, you know, world of machinery. It's nice and warm down there, and again, it's got a graded cover, and you can kind of look up and have these sculptural shapes. It's just simply clad with these metal slats. So again, looking at that kind of transparency, like with the metal mesh at the skate park, you know, depending on your angle and the way that the sun hits it, it can be very opaque, and it can also be very transparent. So that kind of revealing and that dynamism of a facade, it's actually really simple, but it can reveal and then become more of an opaque facade, was also something that we started to work with that then resonated in other projects that we did later on. So here you see I'm back behind it a little bit higher up the hill. And this is a whole school complex. And then you can see, you know, the kind of profile of the mountains as we're looking to the west. And if we back out, this is, as you keep going up the hill, you can see how Bressanone has developed along this north-south corridor, and it's very dense condition, okay? It's not exactly your image of, you know, the Dolomites and the kind of romanticism of the mountains. It's an extremely dense condition where a lot of things have to happen. And there is too also, you know, a light industrial zone, and then you have the historic city center, but you also have a kind of peripheral condition around here that then, you know, straggles out and becomes the industrial zone. And so what happened is that after we started working on these projects, the province became this kind of radar went off, said, oh my goodness, you know, a lot of the budget in relationship to the amount of public money that is spent on architecture is actually much smaller than the amount of money that is spent on infrastructural projects. So infrastructural projects usually are relegated to the engineer, and they don't, up until this date, did not question that much, besides the environmental impact that, of course, they studied their sound and the geology and so on and so forth, but perhaps the actual intersection between landscape, engineering, the ground, and the city was extraneous, let's say, to all of the processes that went into these larger scale infrastructure projects. And so, anyway, I'm being a little long-winded on this. So we were called in by the engineer, actually, for the Ring Road project, which is actually only 6 kilometers long. Okay, so it's not a long road. But it is a road that you see here in red that is in a really compressed condition. And it has, here is where it's underground, where it's a little bit darker. I don't know how much you can see. This is where it's above ground. And then this is where it connects up through a series of portals back into, so this is the light industrial zone. This is into the center, the historical city center, and then this is just north, and then it'll go up to Varna, which is the next township. And so the question was, with these galleries and these tunnels, they were actually in a very tight condition. So in section, this condition was obviously in a valley where the city was located, but it was also where the railway line is located, where the A22 runs through, and where the river runs through. So you have these series of linear infrastructures that make for a very, close quarters, let's say, for this project. And moreover, you have this effect of, for example, the A22 highway. If you're here, or even if you're here, I have a friend who lives in between the railway line and the A22, and it's actually really quiet. But as soon as you go a little bit higher, or on the towns that are halfway up the hillside, you can hear it much more, because of course there's this echoing of all the sounds. So there's also a question of sound. So what we did is we were given a project that the engineers had already worked on this project for 10 years. And they asked us again to do a kind of facelift. And it was really interesting because, as architects, we're used to working in meters or centimeters or, maybe millimeters if you're working in, wood construction. And all of a sudden, you're talking in kilometers, and the kind of accuracy, let's say, of the project is very much infrastructural and not architectural. And so you kind of have to reconcile these two different scales. But moreover, it's, of course, also really functional. So when there's a tunnel, and when it becomes a road, there's no kind of mediation to what that portal might be. So we just identified two kinds of interventions just because we had so little time. It's a project that had already been going on for 10 years, and our scope of intervention was actually really narrow. And so we said, okay, let's work with two vocabularies that can try and bring these, this whole linear, this line of below ground and above ground spaces into two categories. So the interventions that were underground were curvilinear, and it could give a kind of language that we could say, okay, when we're working with engineers, this is a portal that is coming out, and it's definitively below ground, so it's going to be a kind of curvilinear vocabulary. And then the above ground interventions have a more linear formal strategy to them. And this, at first hand, seems really simplistic, but it was actually really helpful to try and communicate this project and have the whole host of engineers that were working on the project say, okay, kind of categorize them, and then we could take all the different scenarios and give a kind of architectural form to them. And so we came up with an inventory of these interventions that went between portals, different kinds of portals, if they intersected with two overlapping roads. Then there's all the accoutrements, let's say, of a ring road. So you have, when you have a tunnel, you have a chimney. that ventilates that tunnel. And then that chimney usually is a stainless steel, channel, huge chimney that comes up, and that's the end of it. And you buy these, you just dimension it, and you find the place, and you bore the tunnel down to connect with the tunnel of the cars. And then you have all the sound absorption walls. And then you have all the paneling that goes on the side. And then you have the electric subplant, and you have the portals that have also the electric subplant. Anyway, there's a whole series of these interventions. Unfortunately, the quality of the beamer is, anyway, don't see it that well. So here are some of the, if you can just understand, I wanted to give just a few examples. So for example, this is the drawing that we were given, and we said, okay, let's try and have a smoother transition between these various elements. This is a street that goes under, this is a tunnel that comes out and then feeds into the State Street. And so if you see here, to try and communicate this really fast, we did some very, like prehistoric collages. Anyway, so you don't see the before and after. Anyhow, so we kind of smoothed out and gave a continuity, because what happened was there was the retaining wall, there was the portal, there was the sound absorption walls, and it was a vocabulary. It was just completely, the Bressanone was littered with all different kinds of functional elements that had to do with the road and had nothing to do with the landscape and the city. So we said, okay, let's try and put these all together and give a kind of language to them that can sit between this really, that can kind of suture together the various conditions along the site. So these are just some images of this project, and if you look, I mean, it's not beautiful detailing, but there's a kind of gesture where the retaining wall becomes the portal, and then that becomes the overpass. There's another road that comes down. And so, we worked really, or these prefabricated panels that are also sound absorption. We tried to give it a kind of rhythm, a kind of texture to it, so that we could try and mitigate this vocabulary that the community was really worried about what was going to happen to Bressanone and so many other towns in South Tyrol, because there was this whole host. There was this like the craze of ring roads everywhere as a mobility solution. So all eyes were on this part to say, okay, so what can happen when an architect comes into play? And so that's what I meant, is a kind of a pilot project. So, in this small context of Bressanone. So they give also a kind of spatial quality to celebrating in a way that can actually, even if you're in a car, you're on a road, you have a certain speed, there is a kind of celebration of going into that ground, what happens to you when you come out, it frames the sky, these kind of experiences that you actually enjoy when you're in the car. And so, just to go on, there's a series of tunnels and portals that we've started to work with that, of course, there's a whole host of signs and, there's a whole world of little details and, just accoutrements that are all create very cluttered environments, let's say. And so we tried to minimize the materials and use just whatever materials that were already out there and that were being produced by the companies that have to do with road construction and tunnels and so on and so forth. So here are just a few images of that give you an idea of that relationship between these portals, the use of concrete, how you can give it a texture that has a kind of urban decorum to it in relationship to the landscape. And here, for example, is the ventilation chimney for one of the tunnels, and there's two of these. And we just had this idea. We said, well, what if we propose the tunnel, the chimney, as a more sculptural piece that had two exit points instead of one. We really had no idea what we're doing, but we thought, let's work with something that has, because you see it, they're very large, you see it from far away. And so the engineers studied, the section and the movement of the air, and said, actually, work. So we were fortunate, and these are some of the drawings that we presented to try and convince the stakeholders that it was possible. And we kind of modeled it really quickly and said, look, it also has a sculptural feel to it, and it does come out of the mountainside where it's along a pathway that people go hiking on. So it's not some far off infrastructural element that you don't have bodily contact with. So that was another thing that we're saying, look, yeah, we're talking about infrastructural elements that have to do with the car, and they're all needed to make this piece of ring road work, but they're also something that's measured up against the human body. So here, unfortunately the images really aren't very good, but here, this is the train going by. Yeah, this is where my friend lives, that I said that she lives here. This is the A22, and then this is the ventilation chimney that you see here, that you then see in winter. You see the really crude 3D print of it, and the scale of a person to the chimney, and it was simply just placed on a series of these, industrial grade concrete base, and it came. I didn't put it. It came assembled on a truck. No, I don't have it. Anyway, so it was already welded. These pieces were already welded in place. And then here they had these rings that with this enormous crane, they lifted it, put it under, placed it, positioned it, and fixed it. And so actually the mounting of it was really incredibly fast. So here you see it a little bit more overgrown. It's all rusted over. And this is the path that you see that people, when they go hiking, there's a series of hikes that go up into the mountains. So like I said, there's this closeness between infrastructure and people walking. So here, just to talk briefly about the sound absorption wall, because of course, this is too tight for a lot of people, rightfully so. If I lived here, I wouldn't be so happy about a new ring road coming in. So we were asked to design a series of, or there were already a series of sound absorption walls, but they were more walls that had this kind of vocabulary here. And we said, no, let's try and have, let's propose linear elements that are more allied to the constructions that they're shielding the sound from. And so we worked with a really crude kind of construction with a really simple module that you didn't have to adjust any height. It just went up and down and followed the topography. So it was kind of a no-brainer in how it was placed. And we worked with these modules. Again, unfortunately, can't see it that well, but just with really kind of crude construction. And with insulation, and the sheathing that had a cap on it, and these are just very crude wooden elements that break up the sound of the cars going through. So you see that along here in relationship to the portals, and they become this kind of backdrop for the usual guardrails and so on and so forth that you see everywhere. So this is, I think, the last, so we just recently completed last year. It's a project that's been phased over a number of years, and we just completed last year the portal that comes out of the central gallery. And this, we proposed this kind of odd shape. We called it the culeto, which is kind of your behind, but I mean, in a very affectionate way. But anyway, so we said, no, we need to have something that, because this really literally comes out right into the historical city center. So this was really difficult for a lot of the people to swallow, that this, there's going to be this huge portal that just pours right into the historical city center. So we proposed something again that was more sculptural and had this kind of vocabulary that was more sinuous and didn't talk so much about this. And it's still working with concrete, also, very kind of crudely poured when you look at it closely, but it has a kind of, it's a gesture that's able to absorb all the imperfections that when you're working at the scale of the street, that it's able to kind of overcome them. And so you first see the shape of the portal, and it's kind of this welcome into town, and then hopefully you don't see, you know, how it's actually made so much close up. So this kind of mouth into the ground, you know, and how, like I said, how you kind of celebrate this from this closed condition to coming out to the light, to then approaching the historical city center of Barcelona. And in this kind of synthetic, in this kind of synthesis of ideas, we were asked to, we were asked by Maxi. They were working on this exhibition that was called Post-Petrol Networks and Architecture. So, you know, that had to do with energy. And they commissioned us to do a project that had a 12-month research span, a research time frame. And then at the end, we were 5 or 6 or 7 offices that had to produce a project that had to do with energy and imagine this post-petrol future. And you know, I think like Sue Fujimoto was one of the other ones. And so we were paralyzed. Oh my gosh, you know, what are we going to do? You know, what is it about energy and architecture that we can propose? And since we had just also started working on the highway, I mean, it just kind of intersected this idea of energy and highway. And we said, okay, well, what would happen, this crazy idea, if we covered, this is a really short version of it, but if we covered all of the highways of the town, all of the national highways, it's a utopic project, it's a conceptual project, with a cover that created a kind of canopy that was an energy park. Because the more we became familiar with the companies that work on the roads and all the legislation that governs what you can do along the borders or above the roads, and your perception of the highway, it's a kind of non-place, you know, it's a place that you try to avoid it, it's gray, it's polluted, it's noisy, and it's not a place that is, it's not a place-making space. So, and married to that was this idea of how, if you think about petrol, you know, I grew up in Kuwait, so I know a lot about oil because that was my history classes were about oil and how you extract it and how, you know, so I have that in my knowledge base that maybe your regular person wouldn't have. And so there's something about, you know, this landscape that I grew up in with like desert, and then you have, you know, the oil drilling and the flames, but that's all you see. And you know that there's this whole reservoir of oil underneath the ground, and it's what, in that mass underneath the ground is what you extract, what you work with to get energy. On the other hand, when you work with electricity is much more visible. At least all of the infrastructure to produce, to capture the sun and produce energy for electricity, it takes a lot of surface area. And so there's something interesting to us about this relationship, again, to the ground, and how energy has these two very diametrically opposed characteristics. So oil had to do with ground and volume, and electricity were like that surface area. So that's where we started, and we started thinking about the national highway system of Italy and how much surface area there is of that, and how that could potentially be transformed into an energy park. And so this was one of our initial sketches and a really quick collage that we had sent to Maxi, because we were really behind, and we had been stuck on like, what are we going to do? So we sent them this collage. We said, okay, this is our concept. I mean, this is literally what we sent them. And they said, okay, go for it. And so we started, you know, doing all of our research and how many kilometers, and which translated into how many million square meters, and then how much energy that could be produced. And that became this really joyous exploration of what this canopy could be and how it could produce energy. And I won't go into that whole subject because that's for another time. And then these, relics of, the glorious post-war past of these that are ingrained, I think, in the Italian psyche of road travel, or the autogrill stations, and how those could become part of an energy landscape. So these are just some images of that. So with that being said, how am I doing for time? I don't have, how long have I been talking for?
It's 9:77. 77.
Yeah.
9:10.
Okay.
About an hour.
About an hour. You know what? Also, I'll present the sports park, and then the hotel will have to be for another time. You have to visit the hotel in person. So, so speaking about, I don't want to overuse this word infrastructure, but that's how it's a competition that we won a couple months ago. It's again in our hometown, Bressanone. It's an invited competition. There were 12 of us, and they were interested in how to create a green infrastructure that could provide services to Bressanone and also implement their sports infrastructure. But it was also a public park. Now, sports in South Tyrol are really important, okay? And public parks in South Tyrol are few and far between because you have the mountains and there isn't really a culture of having a park that's open to the public. And so there was, I've been in Bressanone now for over 20 years, and there's always been this talk of having a park and that it should be accessible to the community, and that their sports infrastructure is, from the 1960s and 70s. And so this competition was a long time coming, and they wanted to connect this. So you guys are already familiar with the river, and Bressanone is this way, and so we're down to the south, and there's this whole area that's already it's called the sports zone of South Bressanone, and so these are these older buildings that are going to be repurposed. They have their track, and then there's a number of other sports facilities, but they wanted to expand all of this to the other side of the river. And so they had this competition, very ambitious competition for a lot of functions, but they already had 2 football fields. So one, they said, you have to leave the way it is, and the other one, if you really have to, you can move it, because it was actually oriented this way. So it blocked completely the possibility of moving across the site this way. From this point to this point, there's 15-meter. It's not that much, but when you start putting in functions and having to traverse it, there's a 15-meter difference in height between one side and the other. And so this is the model that we presented that is inserted into much larger models. So it's not very clear, but basically there's a number of things that this is where the river is, and so we proposed that we could put a bridge here. This is the sports field, the football field that we moved, so that there was this kind of grid, very loose grid, that could help you move across the site, and you encountered a series of sports facilities that you had to integrate with existing ones. So we started working again with the ground. That the functions are very big, so they were asking for 8 tennis courts, half indoor, half outdoor, 2 ice rinks. Ice rinks are very big. I've never designed an ice rink before, and they have a profile that is a standard that you don't change. And so you had these very big, cumbersome programs that were difficult to maneuver in a site that has a certain topography to it, and they also didn't want it to be too present. So, of course, you had to work with the groundscape and creating these spaces underground that were also livable. So that was the kind of challenge of the project. And so here you see a kind of rough, we worked along in a very linear axial way along the street as a kind of extension of this neighborhood. It's called Midland. And this, starting with, and it would be phased in one of the reasons why we won the competition was because we were very clear about the phasing of the project, because we knew they didn't have all of the funding. So we said, okay, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. It's very basic. But to try and get that program to fit all those phases, it was pretty, was very challenging. And moreover, to give it a kind of scale that wasn't overbearing in relationship to the nearby neighborhoods. And so here you get an idea of what those spaces start to look like when you look down across the slope. And as you get closer, you can see with this in plan, the functions. So these are the 4 underground tennis courts. This is the indoor ice hockey. This is the outdoor ice hockey that then also was to become an event space. And they asked specifically that in the center, on the main level, which is not this level, that they had a restaurant, a kind of social space, and then artistic gymnastics, and then Yosei Kambudo, which is martial arts. We tucked into the hillside here. Anyway, it was a very complex kind of program that it kind of jiggled it into this configuration that allowed for the possibility of a public park, which is another reason why I think we won, because we really put a lot of pressure on this area to not have underground parking underneath, so that it could become a real park with big trees. And it became this way of crossing to the other site that would become the green infrastructure expansion zone of the town of Bressanone. And it was also like a lot of competitions now, they ask for you to work with wood. Rightfully so, also because in Bressanone we have 2 really big wood industry, wood companies. So we tried to make this work with these roof planes that had a tectonic quality to them, that were able to provide a kind of beautiful architectural space that had these big mouths out into the light. So you were underground, but you also always had natural light kind of pouring into these spaces. So as you can see here in section, I'm not sure in the back, you definitely can't see. So so this was the proposal that we made as a kind of exterior walkway that then became roof, this kind of continuity between roof plane and ground plane, and that you can walk on top and access, make it a very permeable, because this was a big concern of the project, how you could put these very large functions into really a very residential scale area and make it permeable for everyone and accessible, all, very inclusive a project. So with that, I will end. You guys are ready for the end of the day. Also, I know I have a very fast English. I speak English very fast. I was also in the States for 6 weeks, so my English now got a lot better.
We want to see what's the hotel.
You want to see that?
Yeah. Later.
You want to see it?
Yeah.
Sure.
The hotel in Attia is fantastic.
So, hold on. So the hotel is the first and I think last hotel that we'll ever do, because they're crazy. Hotel people are crazy. They have deadlines that are ridiculous. And they want you to do all the building in their off season, so they don't lose one day of guests coming and paying for their room, because of course they need to fund the project. So anyway, talking about infrastructure, the weird thing about Hotel Icaro Hotel, they renamed it. It was Hotel Icaro, now it's Icaro Hotel, is that it's in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so you think, It's true, it's beautiful. But it is also this. I mean, it's a huge ski industry. It's got a lot of gondolas and ski passes and all the infrastructure that's necessary to keep the ski industry going. And also for all the hiking, and now mountain biking is really big there. So you think UNESCO and you think, these kind of untouched landscapes, but it's actually, again, a very dense condition, all considering. But of course, UNESCO, if you read, because I did read on the website a little bit more, I was a little confused about UNESCO, that actually, if you read their mission statement, it's more about how human settlement and natural conditions are carriers of culture, and how they are settled are actually cultural acts that are part and parcel of that natural condition. So with that being said, I don't know if that's clear, because this was a kind of eye-opener to me. And so whatever you do there, of course, it has to work, because you're in the tourist industry sector. So you are there as you're building, because you're being hired because the client wants you to produce more income for them. But at the same time, you also have to think about the cultural heritage of the site and the kind of majesty of the space of Alpe di Siusi, which is actually, it's really a very breathtaking space. But at the same time, so this is where we're at. It's very dark. I'm sure you can't see. Anyway, let's move forward. So going back to the idea of saying, okay, so we had never done a hotel before. And so, there's a whole lingo that's attached to rooms and restaurant square meters. And, there's kind of, with any program, there's a logic to it. But before we got into that, there's, a number of structures in Alpe di Siusi that have this kind of grandeur to it. When tourism wasn't like this mass tourism, it was the, now it's considered retro tourism, and there's a comeback to it, and they have, those ski goggles now that are kind of retro, and there's this whole aesthetic to it. Anyhow, so we started looking at these structures that are big. They're big structures. They were for that time scale, in the 1930s, they were for the beginning of mass tourism and people with money who would go out and explore, go skiing, and kind of live the high lifestyle. What kind of architecture they were proposing, and there's still architectures today that I think have a validity to them and that are part of their cultural landscape, let's say. So we did, a number of site visits to these places that, of course, they've been watered down by some less interesting interventions. And that's the thing about hotels. When you look at them, it's really, and you'll see our hotel, that, a lot of them are owned by families, and then, the grandmother or the grandfather started it, then the kids, and then each one wants to do their little addition, needs change, and they become these monsters in the landscape, because they're bits and pieces that are added on to these buildings that were initially thought as very clear, simple structures, but they're big and they had a kind of tectonic to them. And this was also the case with Icaro, that started out as a rifugio, which is a mountain lodge, so very, very modest building. And it had this base that was kind of added on to, this very simple structure, and it had a single pitch roof. So these are just very simple, boring observations. But these were the observations we made, because when we came to the project, well, you'll see it, it's a horrific building. So it started like this, very simple and planned. You see that in the landscape, kind of harmless, building, that then as things proceed, so it was the owner was the grandmother, and then her son took it over, and that then became the parents of our client, who's the daughter. So like I said, it's a family affair, and they added on this wing in the 2000s, and of course they need more rooms, and they add on a piece here and a piece there, and it becomes this odd asymmetrical element. And then it keeps going. They have a little, you know, winter, they call it Wintergarten, so a little like solarium, I guess. Then they have the little hut for the sauna, and then they have these little, I don't know what to call them. They have they added these to make it more traditional, but it's a faux traditional. You know, it's like your image of what South Tyrolean, you know, architecture, authentic architecture that tourists would want to go see. When in fact that is not what is local there. Anyhow, so it was just this project that the more you move around it, and then they added these little arches, and then they have, you know, balconies, and I mean, it's just a mess. So, so she invited, I think, 5 offices. She invited Snowetta. She invited, you know, she was very ambitious. She's like, okay, I really want to change the face of this project. It's really important. It's very difficult to get your building permits there. It's really regulated. You have the tutela del paesaggio, so you have the landscape heritage offices in the, you know, it's a listed landscape. It's a listed landscape in the province. And then you have, right behind it is the gondola. So then you have certain distances that you have to maintain. And then you have the city, and then you have the province, and then all of the, anyway, the list goes on and on. It took years for us to get to this project, and it was actually at a time when South Tyrol reconsidered, they put a cap actually on how many hotel rooms could be built, because the hotel industry has totally exploded in South Tyrol. And for example, last year after COVID, not after COVID, but let's say in the false idea that COVID was going away last year, everyone flocked to the mountains, and they, in the news, if you were at all dialed into what was going on in South Tyrol, they had lines. You would go hiking and you were like, you know, in a line with so many people, or you had to wait an hour and a half to get onto a gondola to go hiking, you know. So they put a cap. Anyway, the point being, it's actually really difficult to get this project off the ground, and we decided to simply give it symmetry, a really clear form, cover the whole thing, and redo the roof and work with a single slope. And we sold it as a kind of idea of like, okay, Icaro, you know, with the kind of myth of Icaro with the wings spread out and that connection to the sky with just 1 foot on the ground. But that it was this really clear, it was a very clear, you know, what you saw, you got it. I mean, that was as simple as a gesture as what we were looking to do. But to get there, it was actually really difficult, because when you are confronted with a project that is so discombobulated, you kind of get lost in trying to figure out how on earth you're going to make, you know, give a kind of architectural quality to it. So we started looking, it's not that we started, there's a whole backstory to this, but I don't want to go into it. Anyway, so, because we did this woman, we did the house for her husband, which is the Kostner house, which is the project, let's say, that we became known for, at least in Italy. And when we were working on that project, we became very fascinated by these tangles of a structure in wood that seem very haphazard, but they have really a very, you know, every element is added because it has a structural reason, but maybe as you see it together, it doesn't have a very clear-cut aesthetic to it. But also that there was this idea of a loggia that you see in these rural architectures. And so we started, you know, kind of cataloging these and became really fascinated with that. Said, okay, what if we had, if we started working with these and we create this loggia that connects all the whole facade together facing the south and becomes a framework through which you look out onto the landscape. So, because the other problem is that when you work with, I mean, when you work with a a bar building, if you work for the bar building and it has rooms, it starts to look like a motel really fast, because nobody wants, if you go to your hotel room and you look over, you don't want to see the guys next to you. You know, you didn't go all the way to Alpe di Siusi to enjoy the landscape to then see the next door neighbor in the room in his underwear. So then, you know, what happens is you have to divide up this facade. So we said, okay, let's work with this giant order of the column, because also, you know, it doesn't have a very happy proportion if you have to also, you know, make the divisions and then also cut it in half. So let's use this column as a giant order that connects it all together. So this is a really ugly rendering of it, but this is, you know, how we tried to, you know, subsume all the little quirky things, the faux sauna, this is where her parents live, that she wanted to keep it. There's the new swimming pool, enlarged swimming pool area. Anyway, but to give it a kind of gesture that could tie it all together, and that was, you didn't, if you said Icaro Hotel and you saw it and then you went there, you knew right away where you were. So it was just monolithic, one material wood columns, and that's it. And that way it could have a dialogue with this incredible landscape around it. And so I'll just show you a series of these images that begin to portray that. So this was, we got this off of their website when we started working on that project. So you say, oh, wow, beautiful. And then you see this, you know, oh my God. And then that was the first collage that we did. And then these are some of the images that we started, that, you know, this is what it looks like now. So you see, you know, there's a real closeness. I mean, this is the ski lift right here. These are, you know, in the summer, these are all walking paths. It's not out in the middle of nowhere, but the view is really incredible. So these columns actually have a structural reasoning to them, because if you work with a single pitch roof, the winds are really strong and that roof wants to fly off, and so these columns actually hold it down. So it was very fascinating construction. Also the facade, like how do you give it, we had a very low budget, so how to give it kind of texture and a thickness to it. So we worked with the wood company who devised this device. This was right when costs were going up because of COVID, when things started, you know, the cost of wood went up 35%. So when you're working with wood construction in a hotel, your budget becomes much smaller all of a sudden. So we had to devise, we completely rethought the facade. We had to devise ways in which we could still have an all wood facade if it was required, but to give it a kind of texture, but still work with panels. So these are a series of images. And so this idea of this kind of jagged edge that is measured up against the landscape became also a detail that governed a lot of the detailing of the facade and the rhythm of the handrail, the way you look out through from underneath the building out into this you know, incredible landscape. But then also became details for the interiors that I won't go into, but this is also, we started playing with this kind of jagged profile that it's actually an acoustic ceiling that then became a revisitation in negative of the, you know, the wood paneled ceilings that you find in old, they're called stube, which are kind of like living quarters. It's very colorful on the inside, a little bit crazy. And I'll finish with this. We also rethought the new, let's see if it works. I don't know if it will work. No.
Otherwise, please, the video.
So when it was, we were, you know, this lockdown COVID, the client said, oh, I'm hiring an interior designer to do the rooms because you guys have never done hotels before and you were too expensive, and why don't we do them? And so under COVID, we said, no, well, we want to do the rooms. And so we presented this model by video. Matteo actually made this model because he really loves to work in model, and convinced her, it's like, oh gosh, you don't want just your standard room. you want a room that is like a observatory, a refuge and observatory that, you know, we said there's no landscape without an observer. And so each room became a vehicle through which you viewed the landscape. So it became this kind of telescope, and it has this weird optical effect because these are, you know, it's like your shower room, your bathroom, and like your niche to sleep in, and it became a series of rooms, and the actual sleeping room became this conical, we called it the monocular room, and so then the whole hotel became named after, you know, the telescope room, the monocular room, the wide angle room. It became like this selling gimmick. But anyway, it was a lot of fun, and yeah, she went for it. Yes. Not all of them. But she said, and now of course they're the most requested because they're very strange. And it makes for, you know, a kind of special experience. And so she said, oh, I should have done more. And I said, okay, next time, next project. So with that, I will officially release you.
Okay, we thank Sandy very much for this presentation. Before going to the dinner, and the dinner tonight is because of the maybe raining, we have organized in the pavilion Bacciocchi, so in 15 minutes we can go, but if you have time, we can have a small question and answer. And I would like to open just giving you, not a comment, I mean, something to discuss. Maybe we can find, guys, please. Maybe we can find a common line in your projects, in your process, in a term you said during the conference was medication. I mean, it's like you are making some remedies to some situations. So impacts, infrastructure, noisy, pollutions, also difficult customers, clients. And this maybe it's an important point also for the projects and visions we are asking to the students, to the atelier to bring during the workshop. They are working along the Emilia, so it's a very difficult field, a difficult situation where infrastructure, logistic, artificial landscapes, and so on. And do you think that maybe it is the real dimension, please, guys? Do you think that it is the main dimension of contemporary architecture or urban design? This fact that we need to understand the complexity, understand the difficulties, maybe to fight also with some situation and to figure out a possible way out.
Well, yeah, you guys have been given a very difficult site. It's linear. It's not beautiful. Unless maybe you have a Venturi kind of approach or something. But so I think that one of the things that we find useful for us, I mean, I'm talking just for us, I'm not sure how useful it is, but for us, it's a lot of times, you know, with this complexity, you're oftentimes given a situation that seems kind of impossible. You know, you say, oh, you have to insert a ring road, there's a railway station, there's this, that, and the other, and you have all the obstacles in your way. And really what you're being asked to do is you're asked to simplify, and that there's something that's inserted that is clear and it's understandable, because what's happened as things develop along the periphery, I mean, as I was driving here, you know, there's a lot of periphery around Piacenza. And, but what is it that makes it periphery? It's not just because it's outside of the historical city center, because it's just, there isn't density, or it's a density of things that are so, they're in contrast with each other. There's no kind of glue that, you know, helps your brain visually put them together. And so I think a lot of times, for example, if I was presented with your brief, you know, what are the ways in which you can give a kind of coherence that even though it's very complicated and you can't just have a one-liner simplistic solution, is there a way that you can make density and give a kind of synthesis to a certain situation? Because otherwise you're just adding more. You know, you're adding something more. Maybe it's beautiful, but it's just another thing that you're adding. So is there a way to be reductive? So yeah, I think that's a kind of approach that we use. I mean, we don't work, we're not very minimalist, but there's a kind of reduction of ideas that are actually really not complicated, like the connection between the ground and sky and the ground plane. These are, you know, architectural ideas, landscape ideas that have been around forever. And sometimes thinking very simply, also maybe starting with some very banal ideas, at least it gives you clarity. At least it gives you clarity, and then from there it can be as complicated as you want it. But I feel like it's really important, especially when you have such a short period of time, that you have to have ideas that are clear. And what you're adding is not creating more clutter. That would be a negative.
Some question, comments?
Of course, we can do this over dinner.
For the fourth question in the workshop, there is a prize. So.
For sure.
So I think what was really interesting for me as a student was to notice when you were working on infrastructures, the different attention you were giving to how they were experienced. So some of them would be experienced by walkers, some others by cars. And I think it might be interesting for you to kind of give a hint to how we can be more mindful in our designs as students to how the spaces are experienced, even if they're infrastructures. Because I think sometimes we do that for spaces that are traditionally architectural, but for infrastructures, we kind of lose the idea of it. So if you have any tip on that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the thing about you know, our ideas, but I think it's not, you know, does not apply only to us. But the experiential quality of as you move through space is what binds us all together. I mean, when my kids were little, I remember the first time I went to, this is really banal, but there's two moments that really stick out in my mind. We went to an auto grill, and it was, they had redone it, and it was all made out of wood. And my son, and he was like 4, he said, oh, wow, this place is really beautiful. Oh my God. Just because it was made out of, but there's something about going into a place that had wood that he resonated with that. So just like you know, there is an experience that can be, if you look at it objectively, good or bad, there's always an experiential aspect to design, because whether you're moving fast or slow, or, you know, in the studio that I'm doing, it's for plants and it's for animals, it's not for humans, but that there is always, you change people's experience by what you do. And so that happens also at the infrastructural level, even more so now. I mean, you think about when you go to LA versus, I don't know, New York. I mean, when you go through the city, it's a completely different experience, and the infrastructure is still the road, you know, so what's bounding it, what's above it. And so that is what binds us together through design. It's simply because our perception of what we're moving through. So what's the tip? I don't know, but, you know, I think perhaps the difficulty when you work with infrastructure, and this, I think, is really important. You know, sometimes you have those designers who work better at the larger scale, and then you have those who think better at the detail, and you always have to go between the two. Like a gesture that's large scale is also something that happens at the small scale. And if you're able to put them together, like, okay, here's my gesture of what I'm going to do, my concept. But if I take it really small and I make it architecture, what could it be? And then you go back to the big, and it's always to go between those two different scales. We find that in our work. So for example, for the Hotel Icaro, it's not an infrastructural project. But so we had this idea of the wings or whatever. And we made that model of the wood things without even knowing it, like how it was going to come together. And so it seems like, oh wow, you know, we really studied it and all that stuff. But you go to the client and you say, okay, in the sketch it's symmetrical, and then this is what it would look like. But you don't have the time to put it all together. But you know, in that one instance, that's where you want to end up. So it's definitely like, oh, I want to end up here, but my large gesture is over here. And in the middle, it's a world that you don't know. But you'll get there, you know, eventually. Not in your workshop, maybe. But if you put the two together, I think that's really helpful because it's a gesture, but it's also an experience.
Swap it out.
No, I was very impressed actually with all the information. I'm sorry. I was impressed with all the small architectures related to energy and heating, because I think usually there are mere technical space that drown into the opacity, let's say. And I was really impressed with the coexistence between, you know, a workspace and a leisure space. So I maybe just want to comment with how you deal with the level of intensity of this coexistence, because I mean it's not easy to put together two functions that are different, really distant. Thank you very much.
Well, you have to have good clients. I mean, unfortunately, you know, in architecture, well, we're at the bottom end of a long series of decisions that you have nothing to do with. And so what you're given is what you get. And so you have to make the most out of it. And so I think the question of density is going to always be ever more pressing. And so when there's a condition that you have to do more than one thing, you know, there was for a period, there was this, you know, when I was in graduate school, everything was hybridized, and that was really, you know, like the buzzword. But I think it's become a given because we can no longer think of monofunctional buildings. Buildings have to do a lot of different things. They have to work at a lot of different scales. So, I mean, I feel like it's a premise on which we all have to think about in terms of our work as designers, but you really need a client who can see that, because sometimes you have to propose something that is way out, that's not really part of your brief. So you have to always sell it as an investment that is worth the money. So you have to be really persuasive. That's my husband. He's very persuasive.
I'm going to improvise.
Go for it.
Thank you for your presentation. I come from Lebanon. I'm teaching one of the ateliers. My name is Karim Nader. It's nice to meet you. And I mean, I felt that, I don't want to say that you're a masochist, but that you like situations which are extremely difficult. And I don't know if you like them, but maybe it's what's coming to you. Like even the Icaro case, which I hoped, you know, that you know, it would be a cleaner slate as you start. It was this unbelievable mess as you start, and I was wondering, you know, if I would accept.
Yeah.
If I would accept to start from such a starting point. Yeah, exactly. So when I look at the result, okay, I mean, you brought the clarity. But I mean, if you were given a clean slate, you would have done a better job, I guess. So I don't know. I mean, what would you do? What would you choose? Or what's the dream? Like, would you like situations that are more open so that you can explode creatively? Or do you think that this is the condition of architecture, which I completely relate to? Because I mean, most of the condition of architecture in Lebanon and in the spaces where I work in are extremely constrained. For me, the presentation raises the question of the choice of whether to go for it or not. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a really good question because you know, it's really hard. That's a good question that actually we talk about a lot because, of course, when you start out, you take whatever you get, you know, and we have, yeah, in the beginning. And we have colleagues who are, you know, we kind of grew up together as we started our practices, who are much more, you know, black and white about where their practice is going and what decisions they make. And I can't say that it's something that I enjoy, like, oh yeah, let's go for the most ugly project and let's try to find some beauty in it. But, so no, I don't believe that, okay? But at the same time, we're messier architects, you know? Even if we were given a clean slate, I'm not sure I would do the pure, you know, box building or whatever you would want to say. And, because, you know, it's all of the, you know, that's what makes, for us, architecture human, because it's actually all those kind of irregularities and those exceptions to the rules that are interesting. But it's not that, I wouldn't say we seek it out, because there are some projects that we were like, okay, we thought we could do something with this, and then you get into it and you don't have the power really to transform it in the way that you thought. So we've abandoned projects also. But it's, you know, it is a challenge. And I think, for example, we have friends who they're very much like, oh gosh, I can't believe you guys took that project. They came to us first and we said no, you know. And so but I think it's a really good exercise because that's what you're asked to do as architects. I mean, how many times are you going to get a clean slate and say, oh, okay, if it's not the site, it's going to be the budget. You're going to have to do compromises. If it's not the budget, it's going to be the program. If it's not the program, you know what I mean? Like your compromises come in many shapes and sizes. So I think it's a very good exercise for you intellectually to realize that, you know, our profession is a series of compromises, and you don't see that very often if you go to Instagram, if you're in university, and, you know, there's a kind of patina to it. But I think it's really important, you know, sometimes we come out better than others in terms, I'm not saying better, but like in the work that comes out. But there have been times where we've said, that we've done projects mostly in public sector, let's say school, we do a lot of schools. And we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. So sometimes you have a school that's built in the 1970s. We're working on a school now that's from like the 1970s, and there's no saving grace about this building. But so what should you do? You say, okay, well, I'm not going to do it. But yeah, I don't think we're at a point where we have said no that often. But is it because we like to? Yeah, it's not like so. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, but it's a good question because at a certain point, you know, you have to make a kind of choice of where your practice is going to go.
Or to radicalize the step. So that it won't stand in the way of the mass, like to push more towards the form of purity, so that it would break a bit more the layers of compromise that are imposed by the situation. Which I felt was successful in the schools. Like, you're able to really synthesize it.
Yeah, that's because you had big program. It makes a difference in terms of scale. Yeah. Yeah. We want to get out though. We want to get out though also. Anyway, that's a good topic for. Yeah, it's an existential question also as an architect. Yeah.
Other questions, comments? Thank you. We can go to dinner. Thanks for the first day of our workshop. And after the dinner, we can have time for discussing the art.